From Community Public Radio, this is CPR Sunday. You know, the phenomenon is going on, being played out in South Africa, also within the context of Mugabe nationalizing in Zimbabwe the diamond mines, and that as standing as an example to the people of South Africa who urgently need to do exactly that. You have, let's say you're playing for the allegiance of these of the native bourgeoisies in each case. And say in Brazil, for example, you know, so you're offering to the elite from the United States, basically, look, there's an intensive condition of inequality, economic inequality, wealth distribution inequality, that has been abated somewhat since 1998. So you guys can have back what you had, but of course, those people are pretty impoverished, so you're not going to grow much. And your political position is going to be somewhat untenable because you're going to need dictatorship to repress the impoverished masses. And, of course, we're not always a reliable partner. Just because we decided that we're doing business with you today doesn't mean we won't kick you out tomorrow in favor of somebody else. And China is offering instead, your entire economy will grow. You people will become world-class billionaires playing with China, and you'll have political stability.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I mean, does anybody need a better example of, specifically in South Africa, a better example of just how Western and U.S. focused and European focused the Democratic Alliance, the DA, is? Well, its leader, Maimane, has given multiple speeches at the famous or maybe infamous American Chamber of Commerce. And the Chamber of Commerce really should be understood as basically the principal organ of U.S. economic power projection in the global South. This is true all throughout Latin America. This is very much true in South Africa as well. And in his speech last year, Maimane says, before the assembled, leadership of the Chamber of Commerce, he says, and I'm obviously paraphrasing here, basically, look, China has surpassed the United States as the leading trading partner of South Africa. But for us, the Democratic Alliance, the United States is still the single most important force. In other words, the subtext here is put us in power and we'll replace China with the United States as the leading dominant economic power in South Africa. That is really the larger game that's being played here. It's not about corruption. It's not about any of these other things. It's about economic power and influence in a major global South economy. Obviously the S in BRICS, a very significant partner, perhaps the single most important economy in Africa. I think that's maybe debatable. I suppose Egypt might be up there as well. But regardless of that, South Africa is critical, and the protests, I think, are very important. Now, I should say here, and I just want to be very clear, I've been quite critical of the African National Congress, the ANC, along with its partners in the South African Communist Party, as well as COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. I've been very critical of them. They've gotten deeply in bed with neoliberal finance capital. They've presided over a continued economic disenfranchisement of a large portion of the country. So there are major problems, both political and economic, with the ANC. However, and I've written about that and I've said that quite publicly. That being said, though, I know a destabilization when I see one, and this one is pretty obvious to me. And the reason, of course, is not because the ANC has done business with neoliberal finance capital. The reason is because the ANC is doing much more business with China, and that is really what this comes down to. This is about power. This is about control, and ultimately, this is about hegemony.
Yeah, and I have even been. And many others, quite, correctly, I think, very critical of the deal that was struck by Mandela at the outset to end apartheid, which was quite different from the deal that was accomplished by Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And that is that the economy was left in the hands of the Europeans who came in and stole the country in the first place. They were never displaced from their economic position, and the wealth was never redistributed. And that's something that still is in the minds of the people there, of course, because they're still suffering from it. And I think that there is a large sector of the population that is not going to say it's because these people are corrupt, but it's because of the nature of the economy. Or even these people are corrupt because they left the economy to the same nature it had before, but we got to get rid of them and this economy. And the Chinese don't look like the Europeans. As much as there's been the attempt to excite racism against people from Asia in South Africa, I don't know that that's going to sell quite as easily as a natural antipathy towards Europeans.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if on that last point, I'm not sure I agree necessarily, because I do think that for significant portions, look, I don't want to speak for South African people in general. It's not my place to do, but we do know the power of colonialized minds, colonial mentality, and inferiority complexes. And this is unfortunately true all throughout the global South. We see it over and over and over again in the Middle East. We see it in sub-Saharan Africa, all over the place. That in many respects, oftentimes, especially the middle class in a lot of these countries, they desperately want to be, patted on the head and given approval by white-skinned Europeans.
Even here, that's true in the United States.
Absolutely. That has been quite evident with the support for Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party machine by large segments of the black misleadership class, as Glenn Ford and Black Agenda Report
just go
calls
there.
it.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I don't know that there is necessarily this antipathy towards Europeans and Americans, but there is definitely this very absurd sort of push basically against what has been called the cultural invasion by China. For instance, the African National Congress, that's the ruling party, the government in South Africa, has moved to basically institute Mandarin as a foreign language at the primary and secondary school levels, so that these children who are being educated now will learn how to speak Chinese, and that will then, of course, propel South Africa into a broader non-Western economic sphere for the next generation. Sure. And there's been major pushback against this, and it's not simply because Mandarin, what they say, because Mandarin is so hard, it's not something that's good. It's because they know that is how China will be entrenched as a long-term economic partner in South Africa. That's why they push against that. That's why they want English and Afrikaans and maybe even French and Dutch and some of these other languages to maintain their supremacy in the education system. So there's many aspects to all of this. And again, I just want to note, the economic freedom fighters, the landless peasants movements, the shack dwellers movements, all of these groups that are also protesting against the ANC, that are also vocal against the government. This is not to say that they're part of, this broader conspiracy to overthrow the ANC, but the movement within which they are operating is at the largest level working in the interests of the West. So there is this sort of contradiction, I think, that a lot of people, particularly on the left, have to be aware of, that at the same moment that we want to see, the redistribution of land, the nationalization of the mines, the expulsion of the exploiting Western corporations, and all of these other things that the far left has been advocating and is still advocating, at the very same time, we have to keep in mind that those same forces in the West that we want to be in opposition to are helping to orchestrate and to drive a lot of this movement.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and when I said natural antipathy, obviously I wasn't speaking biologically, as if the concepts of race were biological, and also I'm not discounting the fact that institutionally, still many of the structures, in any event, many of the personnel of the apartheid era still exist there. So
absolutely,
you're going to be cultivating that kind of, cultural activity anyway. But there is, an institutional memory of, a social memory of apartheid. Yes. And the face of apartheid is European and not Asian. So
yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right.
That's one of the elements that's there ultimately. that'll have some influence in one way or another. Okay, so we understand the nature of the assault on the BRICS countries that's being undertaken, I think, and unless you want to flesh that out more. And otherwise, that what are some of the things that are being done as a defense, and what are some things that you see that could be done as a defensive, perhaps a counteroffensive?
Well, there's a number of things, and I just want to finish the point that you were bringing up. Of course, I think that a lot of people, including many of the most vocal opponents of imperialism and colonialism, have talked about the betrayal by the ANC, by Nelson Mandela, the going back on the ANC charter, which had promised the redistribution of land and the expulsion of the corporations and nationalization of all the important industries and all of these things. Like John Pilger and many others have done a lot of work on that, talking about that betrayal. At the very same time, we should keep in mind that the same has been said of Chavez in Venezuela, that he didn't, dispossess the bourgeoisie. He didn't nationalize all the industries. He didn't strip them of their wealth the way that he should have. And there's an argument to be made that had he done that, maybe Chavez would still be alive. Maybe the situation in Venezuela would be significantly better. I think hindsight, obviously, there's a lot to debate there.
Just on that point also, and in fact, in Argentina, the left sat on their hands during the election, a part of the left, and that was why the right-wing president Macri got elected.
Oh, exactly. The certain factions on the left said, we don't support Fernandez, we don't support the bourgeois left government, and lo and behold, the far right wing neoliberal stooge Macri wins by 2%. So absolutely, these it's not like in the United States where both sides are completely controlled by the same interests. There are clear and distinct differences all throughout Latin America, just as I think we're seeing in South Africa as well. And, finally, it has to be said, though, that despite all of that, despite everything negative that could be said about the ANC, a lot has been done and a lot has been achieved in a relatively short period of time. I mean, 20 years, you've seen under ANC rule, I guess a little more than 20 years now, under ANC rule, you've seen millions of houses been constructed, low-income, working-class houses, a lot of people who have benefited significantly, schools, access to education, access to clean drinking water, food security, a lot of these things, including, of course, Western consumer goods, shopping malls, highways, a lot of very tangible indicators of progress, which have been, I think, more, let's say, better distributed than they were obviously under apartheid. But that isn't obviously to ignore all of the glaring deficiencies that still exist. So this is what I'm saying, that it's a problematic contradiction where on the one hand, we want to criticize the ANC and criticize their corruption and their lack of leadership and their lack of, their closeness to neoliberal capital. At the same time, we have to recognize that neoliberal capital is targeting them for destruction and for overthrow.
And not only that, one also has to consider, which I do, as I criticize what happened with Mandela and the abolition of apartheid, one has to consider the fact that this is in the post-Soviet period, that there was no alternative to diktat from Wall Street, Washington, wherever, and that only now the possibility is coming into existence with the BRICS and the rise of China and all of that.
Well, and you've already mentioned it. Look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe refused to engage with neoliberal finance capital when there was no real alternative, and Zimbabwe has been brutally crushed by the West. I mean, the sanctions, the destruction of its economy, all of these things, they're direct byproducts of the fact that Zimbabwe, far less than South Africa, was willing to play ball. That Mugabe, although he tried for many years to work with the British, to work with the United States, ultimately decided to go his own way and to nationalize and to redistribute the land through forcible seizure of the former, the best agricultural land formerly in the hands of white settlers and their descendants. And look at how Zimbabwe has been demonized. Look at how Zimbabwe and Mugabe is, quote unquote, the Hitler of Africa and all this other nonsense that they say about Mugabe. So I think South Africa has tried, to a large extent, the ANC has tried to walk a line between the extreme, call it extreme independence of a Mugabe in Zimbabwe and the extreme subservience that you see from a lot of other quarters in the global South.
So now you're seeing the alternative, at least possibility that is in existence. And again, the types of projects that we've discussed about China doing in Latin America, they also have those for South Africa and anyone else in Africa. In fact, they're building some things like that.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not obviously purely altruistic. I mean, the Chinese want the mineral extraction, they want energy, they want raw materials, all of this stuff. I mean, they want that, of course, for their economy and so forth. But at the same time, as we mentioned, the win-win investment strategy is really the centerpiece of China's entire strategy in Africa and all throughout the world. And that's what's so appealing, because there are no conditionalities. There are, as the IMF does with its loans, there isn't this cycle of debt and debt servitude and debt servicing that you see with the World Bank, with some of these other institutions. And that's really why I think a lot of these countries look at China not only as an alternative, but they really, I think they thank China for presenting them with a different economic model, a different economic development path. And that's what the United States and its allies want to crush. That's why you see this major push against the BRICS.
Maybe we could describe that a little, because what we're talking about, you mentioned Venezuela. You see China, as it extracts raw materials, to put it bluntly or crudely, it also is sending back on those ships as they come back. Instead of them coming back empty, they come back with infrastructure that gets constructed on the on the ground in the country, factories to assemble Chinese-made parts, and income, basically enough money for the economy that the people, even at the bottom, can afford to buy Chinese products, and many of which will be made in the country.
Yes, and let's not underestimate the significance of infrastructure development, rails and ports and roads and all of these other things that
water,
again, I mean, let's not say that this is purely altruistic. I mean, China needs that infrastructure in order to do the kind of business that it wants to do. At the same time, when China's business is done, that infrastructure stays, and that is part of what makes it so enticing. Where look at the options. You're a country in Africa, you want to build, you want a highway built, or you want a port built. Either you go to the Western financial institutions, you take out these loans with all the conditionalities, with the massive interest and all of the rest of that, and then you pay that for the next 100 years if you're lucky. Or B, you invite the Chinese to come in, build it all for you, invest in the country, and then leave that infrastructure once they're done. I mean, it's pretty obvious which of those two is the better option. And again, there's a lot of people who call what China's doing, a form of economic imperialism, which I totally reject. I think that the truth is that what China is offering, although it's along the lines of, capitalist investment, what China is offering is a markedly and objectively better path to economic development. Let's just some quick examples, right? China has built factories that not only for processing raw materials, China has built factories for making for manufacturing consumer goods, right? Consumer goods that will be purchased inside of that country, purchased with money that has been injected into the economy by Chinese investment. So there is a burgeoning market that is developing in a lot of these countries that China is, to a large extent, one of the major engines of. And you see that in South Africa, you see that in Nigeria, you see that in a number of countries in Africa where China is heavily involved. Factories, but also schools, hospitals, many other aspects of critical infrastructure. When you see people in Africa who are talking to each other on Chinese-made mobile phones, and speaking and chatting online on Chinese-made computers, I think that tells you a lot about what China's really doing.
On a small scale, you've seen Venezuela play that role in Latin America. One example that I've discussed with Tony Solo before is the electrical grid, quote unquote, in Nicaragua was essentially a large chunk of it is individual generating stations that came from Venezuela to do a quick build out of an electric grid. They have elements, units that are basically local generators that they've done. And so what they've done though is focus their investment into Nicaragua on building, rolling out an infrastructure so that all these parts of that country that had no electricity before now have that, and from that you build your own infrastructure on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And Venezuela has been doing that in a number of spheres. Venezuela is now manufacturing and selling its Venezuelan designed and Venezuelan manufactured tablets that they're using. Each student in Venezuelan universities has been given a free tablet made in Venezuela with Venezuelan know-how. When I was there, I took a tour of the CNE, the National Electoral Council, and one of the things that they explained to us was this incredible voting system that they have established in Venezuela, computerized, electronic voting machines and voting system, which was designed as a partnership between Venezuela and Trinidad, using Venezuelan and Trinidadian computer technicians, computer know-how and expertise to design what is almost universally considered to be the best voting system anywhere in the world. And of course, Petrocaribe is another example of Venezuela funding economic development all throughout Latin America and the Caribbean space using oil revenue. Of course, oil revenue is now a major problem as oil prices have collapsed. And again, this ties back into this larger thrust, this larger push against the global South, using commodity price collapse in order to deprive them of the capital they need to continue development.
Right. When you're talking about Petrocaribe, for example, you have essentially Venezuela helping to subsidize development in its customers by charging them only, I think it's half. You pay half of the cash now for the oil, and the other half you pay over 20 years. However, as you invest money in your own infrastructure and in your own uplift of your own people, that gets credited against the repayment. So it's a subsidy for development.
Yeah, and I think a good example, or maybe a test case or a laboratory or whatever of all of this is Haiti, right? In Haiti, when Petrocaribe came around, Chavez went to Haiti and he was quite literally welcomed as a hero, right? He was cheered in the streets, hundreds of thousands of people out cheering Chavez because of the subsidizing of Haiti's economic development by Venezuelan oil money. Fast forward to 2010, 2011, 2012, and you have the Haiti, a devastated country that is now quite literally occupied by the United Nations under the auspices of Hillary and Bill Clinton, the Clinton Global Initiative, a totally impoverished and completely devastated country that has very little prospects of anything positive coming in the future. Venezuela wanted to help Haiti emerge out of decades of economic privation.
Centuries.
I'm sorry?
2 centuries, actually.
Yeah, well, if we're going to go back to 1804, absolutely. I mean, 2 centuries of it. But even just in the recent past, Haiti has been economically devastated and obviously occupied numerous times. And this is what we've seen play out now, where Haiti is not only under UN and US occupation, but it is the victim of everything from cholera epidemics to, preventable diseases, diarrhea, and all these other things, child childhood malnutrition, childhood poverty. All of these things are now, rampant in Haiti, and Venezuela and some of the other Latin American countries of ALBA and CELAC, they were trying to prevent that. But of course, circumstances have been that the United States has reasserted its control.
And finally, along that line, when the United States began its economic warfare against Russia yet again, and issued the sanctions in the Ukrainian crisis back in 2014, China said, okay, you're going to try to isolate them economically. Okay, let's put together a $500 billion deal for over long term for the purchase of natural gas from Siberia. And that kind of put the kibosh on the ability of the United States to economically isolate Russia. Not to downplay what has happened, but it was a big boost. Similarly, they could do that with Venezuela, and there have been some deals that were done, but I'm wondering if they can't shore up Venezuela's oil revenues that have been used for local development.
Well, they are doing that. We're seeing a number of deals. Maduro was in Beijing not that long ago. Chinese representatives have been in Venezuela as well. So that is happening. But the situation in Venezuela is complicated, and there is major political upheaval. And I think to some degree, the Chinese oftentimes are, quite cautious when it comes to countries where you have major political upheaval. Maybe, possibly to its detriment, because Chinese economic engagement would be one of the forces that would help stabilize the political climate in a country like Venezuela. But I do think we're seeing some of that. But again, there are a number of factors that basically, I think, prevent China from fully funding and Russia, of course, fully funding Venezuela or funding Russia for that matter. I think number one is that China is looking at its own economic issues. China has seen a major economic downturn in its country. Not only GDP growth slowing, but because of a variety of factors, including the up and down stock market, including the potential real estate issues in China. I think that they are somewhat cautious of being overextended globally, and they have major investments, as I mentioned earlier, in a place like Nicaragua. I don't know to what extent China doesn't want to get financially too far leveraged in the global south. So I think China is trying to walk a fine line here, and Russia is, of course, as well. I think the reality is that Russia is hurting economically. I mean, if you talk to people who are in Russia now, who even those in the intelligentsia down to the working class and the poor, they'll tell you that the economy right now is very difficult. The times are tough. And I think that all of these countries in the BRICS are seeing a major pushback from the empire, whether it's an economic one, whether it's a political one, or a combination of the two. I think that this was to be expected. Now, the question is, and obviously that's the $1 million or perhaps the $100 billion question, is how are the BRICS countries going to respond to all of this? Is the BRICS going to fracture, to break apart under the weight of this economic power that is being projected from Washington and from Wall Street and from London? Or are these forces going to drive the BRICS closer together, force them into further partnerships and strengthening their alliance? I think to a large extent, that is the burning question of the next few years.
And I think that'll be the burning question that we'll open with next week. Eric Draitser, a pleasure talking with you about your upcoming series on the assault on the BRICS by the Western imperial construct. And
please do check it out. It'll be on Mint Press News, mintpressnews.com, I believe.
All right. Thank you very much. Pleasure as always. You've been listening to CPR Sundays. I'm Don DeBar, your host. Look forward to seeing you drop in again next week. Thanks for listening.